the ones that are able to shape and intervene in how we are actually developing technology. So I have a very important slide here that actually tells you why we should be concerned about the connection between communication system and the climate crisis. Because the tech industry overall has a huge carbon footprint. So during the pandemic, I was saying that we saw an incredible relevance of, the increase in terms of our reliance on technology. But what we also saw is that despite the fact that we blocked our movements, we were stuck at home, industry went to a halt at some point everywhere around the world, the emission didn't really fall as much as we could have expected. So the emission, if we look at the recent data by the UN, only fell of about between 4% in 2020. So why is that? Why is that happening? And of course, thinking back, the reason is, of course, that communication systems run and consume a lot of energy. And energy is still highly reliant on fossil fuels. And therefore, the carbon footprint is that extraordinary. So now we have a fantastic study that's been done by Elmeligi and Belkir in 2018 that estimates an incredible, impressive level of carbon footprint of the tech industry that is supposed to even transpass and go beyond the transportation industry. This is really extraordinary. So let's go back a bit, to this incredible 14%. We're constantly told that the aviation industry is the problem of our carbon emission. And yet we have here an example of the carbon footprint of the tech industry that is going beyond to reach the 14%. And so this is where we have to stop and think, to what extent can we reorganize communication systems to really address the climate crisis? And I want you, as students of communication, as communications scholars, but also as future journalists, PR, and people working in the communication industry, to really reflect on the kind of reorganization of communication that we can imagine to address the climate crisis, because it's an emergency. And we have a responsibility as scholars to really do so, and to really think and to change the debate around this. And how do we do this? This is why I got very interested in the development of artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence is actually one of the latest of the developments, right, of our communication systems. And we shouldn't just think of artificial intelligence as something that is almost intangible, like the cloud, right? The cloud is supposed to be this ideal, almost fluffy. It's always presented as something between the white and the blue of the sky, something that is intangible and therefore cannot be polluting. But as much as the cloud is not as intangible, the cloud is incredibly material, then we also know that artificial intelligence is not necessarily only what is, what media reports tell us, what dominant discourse tell us, which is that AI can be defined as the ability of machines to mimic the cognitive abilities of us as humans. Okay, this is the normal definition. And actually, I want to give you also another definition. And if you'll get more acquainted with my work, you will know that I tend to really love definition, because I think the true definition, we understand what we mean, and it's important to break down the ideologies behind every specific use of a specific term, also in communication study. So, like the EU white paper on artificial intelligence, and is very specific about defining AI as a collection of technologies. And it's a collection that actually brings together data, algorithm, computing power, and of course, data, algorithm, computing power means, through cloud computing and through the advances that we saw, especially the acceleration of the last 15 years. And except that this definition actually are missing out on in my view, one of the crucial theme of artificial intelligence, which is the materiality, in fact, of the type of infrastructures that are used by AI to develop their application, are used by AI to run the algorithms, are used by AI to develop all the applications that constantly are attached to this type of communication system. We wouldn't have AI without the recent development of the data economy, the recent development of data capitalism. So I have a better explanation of what's happening. We tend to constantly see that this representation of new technology are given to us in forms of myth. Now, myth, if you want to go back, you could go back to Barth to understand what we mean. You go back to Gramsci, and we can talk about this a bit later if you want, also in a Q&A. But they have also this very special quality of being able to translate what seems complicated into common sense, into something that everybody can understand. So AI becomes this magic wand. AI becomes this magic hand that can sort out all the biggest problem of humanity. And it's very interestingly also all the problems of climate change, for example. So artificial intelligence is this magic wand that is helping us sorting out all the troubles of the world. And it's interesting because when you look at all the documents that are currently talking about AI, you will see that they list all the ways in which artificial intelligence can really help us addressing all the problems of the world, except that they go back to the definition, mimicking cognitive abilities of human beings and a set of technologies and applications that are running on the cloud that are constantly missing out on one major component of AI, which is the fact that relies on communication infrastructures. And this is why we should aim the field as communication students. We should aim the field as journalists. We should try asking the proper question about what actually does it mean? Is it really artificial AI, or is it something that we can really touch? Is it something that can be polluting? And so this is why I spent the last years trying to really make sense also philosophically of what we see as AI, and trying to reaffirm what is a crucial understanding for communication studies, which is that AI relies on machines. It relies on infrastructures that constantly have to deplete. So we saw the data that I showed earlier about the kind of energy consumption that is attached to AI. And of course, the constant use and development of applications, the training of applications that are connecting to the AI, the consumption and the usage is constantly exacerbating the energy consumption, but also problems of e-waste, problem of pollution. And this is where I want to give you a few examples. And this is where we can really stop and connect between and making the connection between the climate and the emergency that I said it's very real. We don't have many years yet. We need to act now. We have COP26 now. We need to start having a debate about technology and the climate crisis. So I want to give an example, and I spent a lot of time trying to make sense of this data. So we have a fantastic new study that has been done at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And it was done in 2019 by Sobel, Ganesh, and McCallum. So they decided to focus on a very specific type of a deep learning model, okay? So now we know that AI is, again, and I'm repeating, like all applications that are mimicking cognitive functions. And very often we don't even think that we're using AI, but AI is present in any kind of very simple algorithm. So once we are using Google Maps, it's very likely that we're using a form of AI. Once we are, for example, being recommended on a system of recommendation system, your favorite music, we are using AI. Once we are using a translator because we are traveling, hopefully very soon, around the world, we are using AI. So we're constantly surrounded by this artificial application of technology that are actually pretty common right now. And so what they did, which is in my view extraordinary because it's been done really for the first time, is they tried to understand the carbon emission of a typical, very common model for translating that is used, for example, by Google Translate. And this type of model was already introduced in 2017, and by no means is it should lead to a general conclusion, because of course the level of carbon emission change and they depend on the amount of energy that is used by the type of networks, computer networks that are used. So the more complex the network, you might understand, the more is the energy that they're using and they need to run. So very surprisingly, we really see in this slide, it took me a long time to actually try to translate, because, you know, from the technicalities of the topic to trying to make sense as in communication, as a journalist, as a communication scholar, it was quite complicated. And then I realized, wow, I mean, we have 284,000 kilograms of CO2 emission produced just by training one language model of AI. Again, I repeat, 284,000 kilograms. And we're always told that when we fly, we are polluting, right? We are emitting a lot of carbon emission. And then you can see in this table, you see that actually a travel between London to New York emits about 1,000, but a model of AI emits about 284,000. So that overall, and I calculated this in the book that I hope you'll read one day because it's out in a couple of weeks, you see that basically the training model equals to something like 10 times a return flight from London to New York. So I'm sure that by now you are getting the extent of the importance of a reflection and the extent of why it is really relevant that we are changing the debate on this. But this is not the end of the story, because AI, of course, as I said, it runs on networks. And so it relies on the cloud. And in fact, the fact that we need to consider in AI is that we're not only producing carbon emission once we are using the system to train the application, but we are also consuming a lot once we are using all the data centers. And data centers are among the most consuming entities on the planet. And I have another slide that shows you that by comparison, there are countries that have the total national energy consumption that is actually like less than the data center energy usage. And this is, of course, extraordinary again. So we need to have a conversation about how do we green data center? How do we make them more sustainable? And there are a lot of corporations that at the moment are involved in trying to make them much greener. But there are a lot of corporations that you will see in the book that are actually telling you that, yes, they are very keen on reducing the carbon emission. And so they're claiming, as Microsoft has been doing now, that they're going negative. But the going negative in terms of carbon emission is actually due to major calculation. The reality is that also Microsoft, I'm afraid, relies on data centers that are highly reliant on fossil fuels, because currently 67%, remember this data, like 67% of the entire energy around the world is still based on fossil fuels. So we need, again, a clear revolution there. We need to make sure that we are only using renewable to produce. So, of course, like this is also connected to not only to the energy usage, but we also should consider the impact of water. So data centers also have generate huge problems with water supply. And of course, again, very often, like think of the major data center in Utah, for example. These data centers are also built in areas that have shortage of water. Think, for example, around Singapore, biggest data centers in the world. Think of Australia, like big data centers too, where there are major problems with water. So again, other problems adding, right? And other obstacles to the graining of artificial intelligence. And then there is another big problem. And this is, in my view, incredibly well connected to the huge issues of global inequalities that are constantly being highlighted by climate change. The fact that countries that have been devastated by colonialism for years in their history, they're still being data colonized, and they're still, unfortunately, bearing, the consequences of the constant disposal, the waste disposal, the lack of commitment to reducing the obsolescence of technology, the fact that we are using so-called data dump all around the world. And again, I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that the major waste disposal in the world are the usual formal colonies. So we have major problems of data waste, e-waste dumped in Bangladesh, for example, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and with massive cost also on the population, massive cost for the soil, for the crops, for the population that are living on resources that are constantly polluted. So again, we need to address this issue of waste. And one of the last point that is probably one of the less known as well about the obstacles and the problems that are generated by AI and the environmental obstacles generated by AI is one of the last one, and I've been spending some time trying to gather information about this. So on the one hand, you will see the major developers of the West, but also the major developers on, in the East. So on the West, it's the usual GAFAM. We have Amazon, Microsoft, Google highly invested in development of AI, but also in the East, we have, the major giants like Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, heavily invested on, artificial intelligence development. And unfortunately, we have now evidence that AI companies are constantly marketing their services to major corporations that are dealing with oil and gas. And actually, if you see the extent of the business that is supposed to come out from AI helping the industry of oil and gas being more efficient just means to be able to extract more. And the thing is that we know that we are on a trajectory to reach 3%, like to reach the 3 degrees Celsius increase. And we can only reach the 1.5 to avoid a catastrophe. So it is really important that we also demand transparency on these major contracts that global digital giants are currently developing. And we need to demand all sorts of green certificate to stop this from happening. And, as I said, like Raymond Williams, who is a major philosopher and cultural studies thinker, has been telling us for years, working from Cambridge, that technology is social. And you can really see this happening here. I mean, technology doesn't develop in a vacuum. We have a chance as a society to decide how we want to develop this technology. But what is important is that we are breaking down this myth that technology is this magic hand that is the divine hand that is gonna change the world. We can change the world if we want to by deciding what kind of technology helps us and by deciding that there is a threshold. And, the European Union, for example, has been trying to do this, especially in the field of weapons. But I wouldn't be, I would expect more from the European Union, not only trying to talk about ethical AI or trying to talk about we can't use AI application for development of AI-based weapon. I think that we can do more, and we can start by a reflection on what kind of applications we can develop in the concept of the climate emergency. Because again, it's impossible to have a conversation around what kind of society we want in the next decade if we don't address the climate emergency. So I'm mindful of time, and I want to conclude now. And I want to leave you with a question that perhaps we can address later on. And the question is really, what are the values that should guide the development of AI in the concept of the climate emergency? What kind of collective values, and what type of ownership do we want for this application, and what type of aims we want them to fulfill, considering the relevance of the climate emergency? So I hope that I gave you a new, perspective to be thinking about the relationship between communication system and environment. And I think that live streaming will end here. So thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you from John Cabot and Antonio, Anthony, and Donatella for having me and inviting me for this series of lecture. Bye. Thank you. Ciao.